The summer sun was setting over Kryfontein when death came for William Stevens. February 2nd, 2021, just another Tuesday evening in this northern Cape Town suburb. Stevens sat outside his home on Rembrandt Street, perhaps thinking about the murder trial that awaited him, or the 100,000 rand bail that had bought him these final weeks of freedom. He couldn't have known that three shadows were already moving through the twilight, that his time as one of South Africa's most feared gangsters was measured in heartbeats. The gunman struck without warning. 9 bullets tore through the evening air, each one finding its mark with professional precision. Stevens, the man they called Red, the general of the 27s, the gangster who'd turned an ancient prison brotherhood into a modern murder-for-hire empire, died where he sat. His blood soaked into the same streets where he'd built his reputation, where he'd commanded respect through fear, where he'd broken sacred codes for profit. In the distance, sirens began to wail. But for William "Red" Stevens, it was already too late. The man who'd lived by violence had died by it, becoming the latest casualty in a war that had consumed Cape Town's underworld for decades. This is the story of how a prison general became an assassination kingpin, how ancient gang codes crumbled in the face of modern greed, and how one man's death exposed the violent heart of South Africa's criminal empire. To understand why Stevens died that February evening, we need to go back to where South Africa's gang culture was born, in the darkness of colonial prisons and the desperation of apartheid's townships. The number gangs, the 26s, 27s, and 28s, emerged in the late 1800s, forged in the brutal conditions of South Africa's mining camps and prisons. These weren't just criminal organizations, they were complete societies with their own laws, hierarchies, and mythologies. The 27s, Stevens's gang, traditionally served as enforcers and guardians of gang law. They were the bloodline, the ones who maintained order through violence. For over a century, they operated by strict codes. Violence had purpose, murder had meaning, and profit was secondary to principle. But apartheid changed everything. The forced removals of the 1960s created the Cape Flats, vast, impoverished townships where families were dumped like unwanted cargo. Gugulethu, Khayelitsha, Mitchell's Plain, these names became synonymous with desperation. In communities where the state had withdrawn all support, where unemployment reached 40%, where young men had no fathers and no futures, the gangs filled the vacuum. They offered identity, protection, and most importantly, income. By the time William Stevens entered this world, the old codes were already beginning to crack. Born into post-apartheid South Africa, Stevens came of age in a time of transition, when ancient prison brotherhoods were transforming into sophisticated crime syndicates, when tradition was giving way to capitalism, when honor among thieves was becoming a luxury few could afford. Stevens's journey into darkness began where so many South African crime stories do, behind bars. The exact details of his early life remain murky, but we know that somewhere in those concrete cells, among men covered in elaborate tattoos that told stories of rank and deed, Stevens found his calling. He didn't just join the 27s, he seized control of them, earning his generalship not through patient adherence to tradition, but through sheer force of will. His face became his resume. Where other gangsters might hide their affiliations, Stevens wore his allegiance carved into his skin. Red was tattooed across his forehead, a name, a warning, a brand. Gang symbols covered his cheeks and neck, each mark a chapter in a violent autobiography written in ink and scar tissue. In a world where intimidation was currency, Stevens made himself into a walking threat. But Stevens wasn't content with the traditional role of a 27s general. Where the old code said the 27s should remain above commercial crime, focusing only on maintaining gang law, Stevens saw opportunity. He looked at his soldiers, men trained in violence, hardened by prison, bound by blood oaths, and saw something revolutionary: a professional murder service. This was unprecedented. Stevens effectively reformatted the 27s from guardians into guns for hire. He built what investigators would later call an assassination squad, a street militia that sold death to the highest bidder. In doing so, he didn't just break with tradition, he shattered it. The 27s under Stevens became mercenaries in a gangster's war, their ancient codes twisted to serve modern greed. Business was good. Cape Town in the 2010s was a city where violence was both problem and solution. where drug dealers and nightclub owners and rival gangsters all had enemies they needed removed. Stevens provided that service with military efficiency. His reputation grew with each successful hit, each body that turned up on the Cape Flats, each rival who disappeared into the night. By 2017, Stevens had become one of the most feared figures in Cape Town's underworld. He moved through a world of shadows and whispers, where alliances shifted like smoke, and today's partner could be tomorrow's target. It was in this treacherous landscape that Stevens would make the connections that would ultimately lead to his death. August 18, 2017, Brian Weinstein, the man they called the Steroid King, was leaving his home when the assassins struck. It was a professional hit, quick and brutal. Weinstein, who'd built an empire smuggling performance-enhancing drugs to gyms across South Africa, died in a hail of bullets. The murder sent shockwaves through Cape Town's criminal ecosystem. Weinstein hadn't just been a drug dealer, he'd been a connector, a man who knew everyone and everything. His death meant someone had decided to rearrange the underworld's power structure. The investigation that followed would expose the tangled web of Cape Town's organized crime. When police finally made arrests in December 2017, the names they announced read like a who's who of the city's underworld. There was Jerome "Donkey" Buisen, boss of the notorious Sexy Boys gang from Mitchell's Plain, a man who'd survived 9 assassination attempts and whose own son would later be targeted at Cape Town International Airport. There was Mark Liffman, the businessman with the murky connections, the man newspapers called an underworld kingpin, while his lawyers insisted he was legitimate. And there was William "Red" Stevens. The trio made for strange bedfellows. Buisen's Sexy Boys were primarily a colored gang, born from the specific racial dynamics of apartheid's legacy. Stevens led a predominantly black prison gang with roots stretching back over a century. Liffman operated in the gray zones between legitimate business and organized crime. Yet here they were, accused of conspiring together to murder the Steroid King. For 3 years, the case dragged through South Africa's overburdened courts. The prosecution struggled with witnesses who disappeared or suddenly forgot crucial details, a common problem when trying to convict men who commanded armies of killers. Stevens, Buisen, and Liffman remained free on bail, their lawyers arguing innocence while the streets whispered of guilt. Then came December 2020. After years of delays and dead ends, something shifted. Perhaps it was new evidence, or maybe someone finally decided to talk. On December 22nd, the Hawks, South Africa's elite organized crime unit, swooped in on all 3 suspects simultaneously. It was a coordinated operation designed to prevent any warning from reaching its targets. Stevens, Liffman, and Buisen found themselves in custody, facing murder charges that could put them away for life. But South Africa's justice system, strained by overwhelming caseloads and systemic corruption, offered them a lifeline. All 3 made bail, 100,000 rand each, about $5,000. It was a fortune for most South Africans, but pocket change for men who dealt in millions. On December 23rd, just 1 day after their arrest, they walked free. Stevens returned to his life in Kraaifontein, but something had changed. The arrest had been too coordinated, the timing too precise. In the paranoid world of organized crime, such things didn't happen by accident. Someone had talked. Someone had given the Hawks what they needed. The streets began to whisper about informants, about gang members who'd turned state witness, about deals being made in exchange for protection. In this world, suspicion was as lethal as guilt. Stevens had 6 weeks of freedom left, though he didn't know it. 6 weeks to wonder who among his trusted soldiers had betrayed him. 6 weeks to feel the crosshairs settling on his back. January passed in a blur of legal preparations and underground tensions. Stevens's lawyers prepared for the upcoming trial while their client tried to maintain control of his crumbling empire. The arrest had shown weakness, and in the gang world, weakness attracted predators like blood in the water. On January 27, 2021, violence struck close to Stevens's world. Joel Buisen, Donkey's son, a rising figure in the Sexy Boys, was ambushed at Cape Town International Airport. The attack was brazen, professional, and nearly successful. Joel survived, but the message was clear. The underworld war was escalating. If the son of Stevens's co-accused could be targeted at the airport, surrounded by security and cameras, then nowhere was safe. February arrived with the African summer at its peak. The Cape Flats sweltered under cloudless skies while beneath the surface, tensions reached boiling point. Stevens must have felt it, the way conversations stopped when he entered rooms, the nervous glances of formerly loyal soldiers, the whispers that followed in his wake. February 2nd began like any other Tuesday. Stevens spent the day handling whatever business occupied a gang general facing murder charges, perhaps meeting with lawyers, perhaps trying to shore up his position within the 27s, perhaps simply trying to enjoy what he couldn't have known were his final hours. As evening fell, Stevens took his place outside his Rembrandt Street home. It was a routine that spoke of confidence or perhaps defiance, a general holding court in his territory, visible and unafraid. The summer heat was beginning to break, a breeze carrying the distant sounds of township life, music, laughter, the ordinary chaos of Kryfontein after dark. At approximately 6:35 p.m., 3 men emerged from the shadows. They moved with purpose, with the economy of motion that comes from experience. They'd done this before. They knew their trade. The first shots shattered the evening calm. Stevens had no time to react, no chance to reach for a weapon or dive for cover. The assassins were professionals, and they'd come to do professional work. 9 bullets found their target, headshots, center mass, the kinds of wounds that leave no doubt about intent or outcome. Stevens died where he sat, his blood pooling on the ground where he'd built his empire. The general of the 27s, the man who'd turned an ancient brotherhood into a modern murder machine, was gone in seconds. The assassins vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, melting back into the township's labyrinthine streets. Within minutes, Rembrandt Street was a crime scene. Police cars and ambulances converged, their lights painting the walls red and blue. Neighbors peered from behind curtains while others gathered in the street, drawn by that mixture of horror and curiosity that follows violence. They all knew who William Stevens was, what he represented. Some mourned, some celebrated, but all understood. This was bigger than one man's death. The news spread through Cape Town's underworld like wildfire. Within hours, Kryfontein erupted. 27s and 28 soldiers took to the streets, turning grief into gunfire. The rival gangs, ancient enemies whose hatred stretched back generations, seized the moment to settle scores. Drive-by shootings lit up the night. Automatic weapons chattered their deadly songs. By dawn, the body count had risen, though the exact number remains disputed. The streets had their own way of handling transitions of power, written in brass casings and blood. At Stevens's funeral, the underworld came to pay its respects. 2,000 mourners filled the cemetery, gang members, family, and the simply curious. The police, fearing violence, had banned the traditional 21-gun salute that marked a general's passing. Instead, the 27s performed their ancient rituals in silence. They carried Stevens's coffin on their shoulders, stamping the ground in unison, the sound echoing like war drums. In prison, every 27's member shaved their head and observed a week of mourning, even ancient enemies acknowledging the fall of a general. The investigation into Stevens's murder moved with surprising speed. Unlike so many Cape Flats killings that remained unsolved, this one had the focused attention of the Hawks. They worked the streets, leveraging informants, following the money, tracing the whispers. The trail led them to the 28s, the 27's traditional rivals, and specifically to a subset called the Firm. In June 2024, more than 3 years after Stevens's death, police arrested 3 men, Jonathan Cloete, Abraham Wilson, and Shaquille Pelston. All 3 were allegedly members of the Firm, a 28's affiliated crew known for professional hits. But they weren't the masterminds. According to prosecutors, they were just the triggermen, hired guns in a larger game. The real architect, police claimed, was Ralph Stanfield, a boss in the 28s and leader of the Firm. Stanfield's history with the law stretched back years, including a 2014 case where he and corrupt police officers were accused of running a guns-to-gangs operation, illegally supplying firearms to gangsters. That case had never been properly resolved, leaving Stanfield free to build his power. Now, prosecutors alleged, he'd ordered the hit on Stevens as part of the endless gang warfare that consumed the Cape Flats. But was it just gang rivalry? The streets whispered other theories. Some said Stevens had been killed because his men had turned informant in the Weinstein case, that he'd been silenced before he could make his own deal with prosecutors. Others claimed he'd broken too many 27's traditions, angered too many within his own organization. In the shadow world of Cape Town's gangs, truth was as elusive as smoke. What we know for certain is this: William "Red" Stevens lived in a world where violence was currency and life was cheap. He'd risen to power by embracing that violence, by turning ancient traditions into modern profit centers. He'd built an empire on blood and bullets, commanding respect through fear, loyalty through intimidation, and in the end, that same violence consumed him. As I write this, the trials continue. Stevens' alleged killers await their day in court while Ralph Stanfield fights the charges from behind bars. Jerome Buisson still faces trial for the Weinstein murder, though his co-accused is now forever beyond justice's reach. Mark Liffman met his own violent end in November 2024, gunned down in a parking lot, another general fallen in an endless war. The Cape Flats remain trapped in cycles of violence that seem to spin faster with each passing year. In Mitchell's Plain, in Kryfontein, in Khayelitsha, young men still see the gangs as their only option, still choose the gun over the grinding poverty of township life. The 26s, 27s, and 28s continue their century-old dance of death, their ranks refreshed by each new generation of the desperate and discarded. Stevens' death changed nothing and everything. The violence continued. Just days after I researched this story, 5 more died in Mitchell's Plain gang shootings. The drug trade flows on, the protection rackets persist, the assassinations continue. But something shifted that night in Kryfontein. The old general was gone, and with him, perhaps, the last pretense that the number gang stood for anything more than profit and power. In life, William Stevens had been larger than life, a figure from South Africa's criminal mythology made flesh, his face a canvas of intimidation, his reputation written in the fear of others. In death, he became something else, a cautionary tale, a reminder that in the world he'd chosen, everyone is expendable, even generals, even kings. The sun still sets over Kryfontein, painting the township in shades of gold and shadow. On Rembrandt Street, life goes on. Children play where Stevens bled out. Families struggle with the same poverty that drove him to crime. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, new generals rise, new alliances form, new violence breeds. Because in the end, Stevens was right about one thing. In the merciless world of Cape Town's underworld, there's always someone willing to pull the trigger. The only question is when your turn comes. In a life ruled by violence, death is the only certainty. And for William "Red" Stevens, gang general, murder broker, fallen king of a crumbling empire, that certainty came calling on a Tuesday evening in February, delivered by 9 bullets and 3 shadows in the African twilight. The war goes on. The streets remember. And somewhere tonight, another young man is making the same choice Stevens made all those years ago, not knowing that he's already written his own ending. In Cape Town's killing fields, everyone dies a soldier. The only difference is whose name makes the headlines.